Okay, this is my second response to the CES letter, but before I continue, I would at this time like to re-emphasize that this is my own personal responses and answers to the questions and issues raised. This should not be taken as an official source for the church. I do not speak for the church as an organization, nor do I speak for the leaders of the church. This is just me as a personal member offering my insights into the issues that are raised in this letter. Having said that, this will deal with the second issue raised in the first category of the letter. That first category again is titled Book of Mormon, and the first question states, when King James translators were translating the King James Bible between 1604 and 1611, they would occasionally put in their own words into the text to make the English more readable. We know exactly what these words are because they're italicized in the King James Bible. What are these 17th century italicized words doing in the Book of Mormon, word for word? What does this say about the Book of Mormon as an ancient record? And now, in this issue, they give us two examples. The first being Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1, as compared to 2 Nephi chapter 19, verse 1. The second is Malachi 3:10, as compared to 3 Nephi 24:10. In this video, I will address the second issue first, as it is a simpler one to address, and I will come back to the first one in more detail afterwards. However, before I do so, I believe that it is always a good idea to check your sources when dealing with things of this nature, especially if you are planning on making a response to it. So, in my experience in discussing and researching various questions and topics regarding LDS doctrine, I have found on occasion, it's not often, and I'm not saying people do it on purpose, but on occasion, sources that are given are wrong, or they are misquoting the original documents. And so I find it to be a very good idea to always check the sources. In this, the main sources used are the scriptures, either the King James Bible or the Book of Mormon. I have already gone through and verified all the sources that are given in these examples, and so I will not refer back to that again in this video. I just wanted to make that point that it is always good to check your sources. And with that, let us move into examining the two examples that they give. So let us look at example number 2, Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, as compared to 3 Nephi chapter 24, verse 10. Now, I'm going to use our church's website. The domain is thechurchofjesuschrist.org. And I use this simply for convenience. Our church still publishes the King James Bible, and it is found on the website as well as the Book of Mormon. And since these are our primary resources, they're just convenient to find here. So, let us read this verse in Malachi. Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Now, as I said, this is the King James Version reproduced on our church's website. And if you look here, you can see 7 words in italics down at the last line. There shall be room and to receive it are all given in italics. Those are the words added by the King James translators to make the English more understandable. So let us compare this verse to 3 Nephi chapter 24, verse 10. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And if we look here again, those same 7 words do appear in this verse. There shall be room and to receive it. So looking at the two sources that they give, we can verify that yes, indeed, the Book of Mormon does use the italicized words from the King James Bible. So now let us return momentarily to the CES letter. Now, on this example, they make this observation criticism. And it says here, in the above example, the King James translators added 7 italicized words to their English translation, which are not found in the source Hebrew manuscripts. Why does the Book of Mormon, which is supposed to have been completed by Moroni over 1400 years prior, contain the exact identical 7 italicized words of the 17th century translators? Now, first of all, I have to point out that Moroni did not add these words in. None of the ancient prophets did, any more than Isaiah had these words added in himself. They were added by the King James translators. In like manner, they were added by Joseph Smith. To state this the way they do, they are trying to imply that these words were on the gold plates that Joseph Smith was translating from. And that is not an accurate depiction. What was written on the gold plates, we are told in the Book of Mormon, is, or was, a language that is not known to modern scholars, and it is called in the Book of Mormon Reformed Egyptian. So these words didn't appear on the gold plates. They were not written by the ancient prophets. They were added by Joseph Smith, just as they were added by the King James scholars. So the question here should not be asking why Moroni or anybody else would have added these. The question is, why did Joseph Smith choose to render the translation in the same way that the King James scholars did? So in answer to the question of why Joseph Smith rendered his translation in the same wording as the King James scholars, the answer to this is very simple. It is a convention of translating that you take what is already there, what has already been translated, and you keep it, changing only what is necessary to correct errors. The reason for this is to avoid as much confusion as possible. So, if you are quoting from an ancient text of a foreign language, then you don't write your own translation. You simply use the translation that is already common, familiar, and accepted by the audience you are writing to. To illustrate this, many years ago when I first started getting into these discussions with people about our church's doctrine, I had a friend that we would frequently discuss doctrine with, and one day he quoted the Bible to me. He got his Bible out and he read a verse from the Bible. But I didn't recognize it. It was completely foreign to me. And so I got my Bible out and I looked up the reference and it said something very different. Or at least appeared different because the wording was so different. And after a little while of, trying to work out this confusion, we figured it out that he was using what is called the NIV, or New International Version, which is a more recent translation of the Bible, while I was still using the King James Bible. And because the wording was so different, it caused a break in translation for us. We couldn't understand what each other was saying, and it took us a while to figure out that the translations were basically saying the same thing, but it just caused a lot of problems in trying to discuss the meaning of the Bible. And for that reason, Joseph Smith would have followed the same convention in translating the gold plates into what we have as the Book of Mormon. God would know this convention of translating. He would know that there's generally a fairly high potential of creating confusion when you are just producing an entirely new translation. So he would have directed Joseph Smith to render his translation as nearly as possible to what was already known and familiar to his audience, and that was the King James Bible. So these italicized words were used to keep the text as familiar as possible. Now, this convention is also followed by the King James scholars. They did this themselves when they were translating. And if you look back, they had 15 rules of translation that they had to follow. These were rules given to them by King James, because King James wanted a good translation. The first rule that they followed states that the ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, to be followed and as little altered as the original will permit. In other words, the very first rule they had to follow was don't change anything unless you absolutely have to, unless you need to correct an error in translation. Other rules are very similar to this, such as Rule 2, which says don't change any names. Rule 3 says keep ecclesiastical words, such as church, the same, because these words were familiar to the audience. Now, this first rule does mention only the Bishop's Bible, but if you go down and you look at Rule 14, it states that these translations to be used when they agree better with the text than the Bishop's Bible, and they list Tyndale's, Coverdale's, Matthew Rogers, Whitchurch's, the Geneva Bible. So he had a list of previous translations and saying if you can get the correct translation from any of these editions, any of these translations, use it, because these things are already known and familiar. Only render your own translation if none of these have given a correct translation of the original material. So Joseph Smith, in translating the gold plates into the Book of Mormon, follows this same convention. When you're quoting the Bible, you use the Bible that is known. Now, the Book of Mormon does make significant changes to the King James text. It does quote some, but it changes others. Some of them very significantly, such as in 2 Nephi chapter 27, when we get extensive quotes from Isaiah chapter 29. But these quotes are added to significantly. There are large passages that don't appear in Isaiah, but do appear in 2 Nephi. So he changed what was needed to be changed, but left everything that was already had, that was correct, the same. He followed this convention of translation. Now we know his translation is correct because he is a prophet, and he was translating by the Spirit of God. Through the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, he was given the correct translation, and it just so happens that many passages of the King James Bible were correctly translated and didn't need to be changed.